Hello and welcome to this episode of Developing Classical Thinkers. My name is Winston Brady. I'm the host for DCT. This podcast is a project of the faculty at Thales Academy. We're a network of private classical schools with campuses based mostly in Raleigh, North Carolina, but we also have campuses outside of Richmond, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, and Charlotte, North Carolina, with more campuses coming on board each year. On this podcast, we usually talk to teachers sharing the amazing things that they're doing inside their classrooms, but we also talk to like-minded classical educators about the values and virtues of classical education, what makes this movement so unique and so valuable for students today. And I'm speaking with a friend and content expert, Dr. Eric Wearne, today about an amazing study that he did on what parents are actually looking for when they're choosing a classical school for their students. So Eric Wearne is a visiting associate professor with the Education Economics Center at Kennesaw State University. He was previously provost at Holy Spirit College, associate professor of education at George Gwinnett College, deputy director of the Governor's Office of Student Achievement in Atlanta. Dr. Wearne's research focuses on education policy, school choice, and the history of American education. Dr. Wearne, thanks so much for being on Developing Classical Thinkers today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Winston.
Just to start off, could you tell our audience just a little bit more about your background? Because you are a homeschooling dad. You've been teaching economics for a number of years. You've done a lot of the education policy for the state of Georgia. Like, you have an insanely impressive pedigree. So I'd love for just you to tell our audience just more about your background and how you became interested in looking at the data from classical schools.
Sure. So I started out, you're very kind, first of all, Winston. I started out after I graduated from college as a high school English teacher at a normal large public school here outside of Atlanta. I did that for a few years and then went to graduate school to study education policy, thinking that I would just go and get hired at a university somewhere and that would be the end of the story. Instead of that, I got a job with the governor's office here in Atlanta, doing education policy work for the governor at the time and for the legislature. After a few years of that, I think that's a good gig to have for a few years, but it's good to move on from that after a minute too. So I took a job with a College of Ed at another school near Atlanta, doing research on education policy and school choice and things like that. And while I was there, in the meantime, I discovered two things. I discovered classical education and I discovered hybrid schooling. So that really became my research agenda, was to look at hybrid schools, which are schools where the kids are in brick and mortar schools 2 or 3 days a week usually, and they're homeschooled the rest of the week. So I actually came to learn about those and to learn about classical education as a parent. So my wife and I helped found a high school program at a classical hybrid school almost 15 years ago now. We've had a couple of kids graduate from there and more that are still there. But while I was doing this, I'm interested in school choice. I'm interested in classical education and hybrid schooling. No one was really looking at the hybrid school model from an academic perspective. So I started writing papers. One thing led to another. My book on the topic, which was based on a number of papers that I did, came out. I handed the manuscript over to the publisher in the spring of 2020. And about a week after I did that, we closed every school in the country and people got very interested in unconventional school models. So I've seen the growth of the hybrid school movement, and it looks a lot like the growth of the classical school movement, right? So we had some pioneers in the 90s and the 2000s. And in the last 10 or 15 years, they've both really kind of become incredibly more popular. A lot of hybrid schools are classical schools at the same time. And so just in my role as a researcher and as a parent, I've been interested in both of these things. And after a few years at the teacher college, I landed here at Kennesaw State, where I have a research center focused on hybrid schools. And I follow the classical movement at the same time.
I got to say, I love the title of the book, Little Platoons. Is that an Edmund Burke reference?
It is. It's Edmund Burke via Russell Kirk.
Okay.
Right. So Russell Kirk wrote about how large, big education was sort of failing us in the 1970s.
Could you explain the reference? So the family is the little platoon of virtue, whereas the hybrid schools, you're really bound. Hybrid schools, 2 days in-person classes with the teacher, a little bit more conventional in that way, but 3 days a week they're at home. So really, like the bulk of the schooling is really being done by the parents. So is that I mean, it's a nice way of balancing, say, like that in-person instruction and the in-person instruction and the homeschooling, where the parents really are taking more of that sort of ownership. I mean, do you think Edmund Burke would be happy with a solution like that?
I think that's right. I think the way a lot of these schools originate is little groups of families who want a very particular focus for their kids' education. So either they start as a group of, a couple of families homeschooling together, or they start with just a small group of people who have a really particular idea about the kind of school they want to start, and they just band together and they kind of very do-it-yourself kind of it. And so yeah, it's the little platoons coming together to kind of ignore what everyone else is telling them they're supposed to do what they want instead.
Oh, I love that. So a couple weeks ago, I heard you speak at the Circe Forma Symposium, and you had conducted a survey of parents at classical schools, and you had asked them essentially like what they're looking for, the sorts of outcomes, the sorts of influences at the school their children attend. I'd love to just pick your brain about that study and what you found. But can we start off just, how did you set up your survey, and what sort of goals did you have going into it? What was your hypothesis or series of hypotheses that you were testing as you were going about and setting up your study?
Sure. I got interested into it because of this. I start the paper by talking about the sort of exponential growth in the classical schools movement. And we saw the same kind of thing in the hybrid schools movement. And there's been a big change since COVID, right? In the sense that prior to COVID, we had a lot of a pretty like-minded group of people doing a really, really obscure and sort of high identity kind of project. COVID came along and people got really interested in lots of different things, including hybrid schools, including classical education. But what happens when you bring in kind of the marginal person, like the next person who is newly interested in your idea, sometimes they don't completely align. So in the hybrid school setting, what I was seeing is, the new people, the people who are newly hybrid schoolers are much more interested in kind of preserving some of the vestiges of public or whatever kind of conventional schooling, right? So they like football, right? they like big events, right? Which a lot of the previous hybrid schoolers had kind of said, you know what, we don't really need these things. And I was curious if the same thing was going on in the classical school world, right? So we have lots of people who are newly interested in classical education. But what do they mean by that, right? Are they attracted to the same kinds of things that people who've been doing it for a long time are attracted to? Or, right, are they pulled to the same kinds of ideas? Or were they just looking for some other thing than what they were experiencing in their conventional schools prior to and during COVID? So with that in mind, what I wanted to get at kind of three different buckets of ideas with this paper. One is, first, just how do you define classical education? The second was, what kind of academic outcomes are you looking for? And the third is, what kind of general life outcomes would you like to see? So there's been a little bit of empirical work on classical education, not a ton. But the way I approached it was to do an online survey. So the survey went to a huge list of classical schools around the country of all kinds, right? 5-day, hybrid, private, charter, all kinds. And through the school leaders, I asked them to send it along to the parents. So I have a combination of school leaders and parents. And the way the survey was set up is something called, or the technique is something called a max diff survey. So one way I could have done the survey was just to ask them, what do you like about classical education? But what you tend to get back when you do surveys like that is just a big laundry list of checks that they like everything, right? So in the max diff survey, what happens is I come up with lists of items. So if you think about the last time you made a big purchase, you might list a lot of things that you like, but if you did that for every car you bought, your car would cost $1 million, right? So you have to make choices about which facets or aspects or features matter the most to you. So with this survey, I came up with 12 definitions of classical education from various sources, 12 academic outcomes. Half of them were kind of virtue and tradition based, and half of them were more modern. So virtue, classical pedagogy, things like that. And on the other side, college and career readiness, individuality and self-expression. And then 12 bigger life outcomes. So those were things like involvement in religious institutions after graduation, getting married, things like that. And so the survey software then will present the respondents 3 of these items randomly at a time, and the people have to choose what they think is the most important and the least important among those 3. So what that does is, as people are taking the survey, they're forced to kind of think through trade-offs and kind of declare their preferences. And so over the course of the whole project, you can kind of get a sense of, as a group, which items do they think are the most important, which do they think are the least important, and which are they sort of ambivalent about. So we did that, and then we found out we got responses in all 3 of those different categories. You asked about hypotheses. My only hypothesis was the items that I sort of tagged as belonging or being related to virtue and tradition would be the highest rated ones, and the more modern technocratic ones would be the less well rated. And that was mostly true, but not entirely true.
And can we start off with the definitions of classical education? And so, like in your survey, you had a number of, one from CIRSE, the Center for Independent Research in Classical Education, one from Classical Academic Press, one for the Society for Classical Learning, one from Joshua Gibbs, who writes pretty prolifically on CIRSE's website and conference speaker. Was there a definition that, what definition proved to be the most popular? It was CIRSE's, wasn't it? And Classical Academic Press, were they tied?
They were very close. Classical Academic Press was the most popular one by just a little bit. Then Hillsdale and CIRSE were after that. Josh Gibbs actually had 2 definitions listed in there. One was a definition that I think he sort of offers as a good definition of classical education. And the other one was a definition that he put in the voice of a parent who completely misunderstood classical education and was saying things like school is, a time to find yourself. We should have all kinds of different books and topics. And so thankfully, people chose that bad definition as the least preferred option. So I hope that means they were paying close attention to the survey the rest of the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For the most part, the definitions that were related to virtue and tradition did score in the higher end. And the ones that mentioned things like more modern things like lifelong learning or professional pursuits scored lower. But yeah.
And I'll read Classical Academic Press's and CIRSE's definitions.
Sure.
So, classical education is a long tradition of education that has emphasized the seeking after of truth, goodness, and beauty, and the study of the liberal arts and the great books. So I think we all reasonably happy, right, that they gravitated towards that. It's including the liberal arts, the great books, the transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness. I like and appreciate immensely that you chose something of like a red herring. School is a place to find yourself, to self-actualize, to develop like personal autonomy and things like that. That sort of modern, expressive individualistic streak that's so prominent in education. Joshua Gibbs had another one in here too that just screams the ordo amoris and the right loves. Classical education exists to help students love the right things and to help them love the right things in the right way and to the right degree. It's a place for people who know they don't love the things they should love, or that they don't love them enough, or that they love unimportant things entirely too much. So, did you feel encouraged that parents were gravitating towards like an understanding of classical education that's rooted in truth, beauty, and goodness, like the values and virtues that I think we would associate with the movement founded on the great books of the Western canon?
Yeah, so these were all either parents or administrators currently at classical schools. And so, yes, that was definitely encouraging that they were gravitating towards the things that I thought were sort of more commonly understood as part of the idea of classical education. There's a lot of contention over this still in terms of the canon, the purposes, and all of this. So I think it gladdened me to see that there was some agreement on a set of definitions, and agreement on a set of definitions that were much less preferred.
I think where like your talk at Cersei in the study itself gets really interesting as we start talking about like academic goals and then life outcomes. So could you tell our audience what you found to be the most surprising about the academic goals and what parents wanted versus maybe what makes sense or what you were expecting?
Sure. So yeah, this is where my hypothesis about virtue and tradition broke down a little more. So you can't see it, but the most popular item by a mile in terms of academic outcomes was virtue.
But did they know what virtue was?
Right. Well, yes, they must, but I don't know what they think. Virtue is undefined. I just said the school promotes virtue, and the highest score that was one of the highest scores on the entire survey.
80, right? So plus,
80 out of a possible 100. Right?
Yeah.
So that was encouraging. At first brush, that's encouraging, right? So they classical school parents and leaders want their schools to encourage virtue. That's good. The next one was classical pedagogy, but again undefined. So I don't know if they meant they really like classical books, or they really like Socratic dialogue, or they really don't like standardized tests. I'm not sure exactly what they meant by that, but that was the next most important. Interestingly, a couple of the next really popular ones were just basic academic skills, so literacy and numeracy, which I thought would be kind of a lower bar and wouldn't be preferred as much, but it was the third most cited option, was just basic academic skills. And then close after that was maximizing academic potential and achievement, which this may be me, but I kind of read that as pushing for, high SAT scores and things like that. But they really preferred it. So I found those are sort of interesting. At the other end of the scale, some of the really negative, the less preferred options, and you have to remember these are all in relation to each other, right? So in theory, a parent could have picked that they like all of these things or dislike all of these things. But the one that was really not preferred was individuality and self-expression was not seen as an academic outcome that they wanted from their classical schools. Neither were college readiness or career readiness. But we can talk about that in later life outcomes too. So I wonder if those terms are sort of tarnished, but people didn't like those. But a few other negative, on the negative end choices that surprised me were things like appreciation for Western civilization and appreciation for visual and performing arts, which, if not performing arts, I would think that most classical schools are really promoting appreciation for Western civilization. But the parents and the school leaders didn't really choose it. And then I'll just end with this one. The last one that I'll bring up is promotion of religion was an interesting finding in this case too. These are not entirely classical Christian schools, but the overwhelming majority are classical Christian schools of some denomination. Religion actually scored a -3, which is pretty close to ambivalent on this scale.
Yeah, they could take it or leave it.
I would have thought that would be much higher. And the way these max diff operations work is a score close to 0 could mean one of two things. It could mean that they're totally ambivalent about it and no one chooses it, or it could mean it's really polarizing. So people really don't like it or they really like it. So if I look under the hood, what I find is it's about a third, and a third, right? So some people really were against the promotion of religion in their classical school. Some were really for it, and then some were just not choosing it.
And that seemingly goes in line with, are people going to that classical school because their local public school has not served them well? So in that case, they may be more like secular, but they want, is that the way that you're reading it? They want more of a safe environment for their student, not a place that's going to inculcate them in a particular religious tradition?
Right. So right. The classical school is maybe not entirely their cup of tea, but that's the next best option that they have compared to other schools. It could be also, they really are into classical education, but the school that they have access to is maybe not in their denomination, so they don't want religion of the school promoted, but they're happy with generic virtue being taught. But then, there are parents who thought that, they did select religion a lot of the time. So I think it's all over the place. I think this is a question for me to kind of poke on a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting, the individuality and self-expression comes in at a -65. Did you give any definitions there as to what you were getting at as far as individuality and self-expression?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I read into that maybe like rebellious teenage years and, a desire to be an artist or live a bohemian lifestyle. I don't know if anything surrounding that particular option gave a hint as to what sort of individuality the parents were thinking of their child expressing, or at least hoping that they wouldn't express.
Yeah, it didn't. I didn't give. That's sort of like virtue. I didn't really give them much direction there. My inspiration for it, if you read the paper, you can see how I cut them between virtue and tradition and more modern. The idea for that one comes from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which I think if I had listed that, it might have gotten an even lower score. But yeah, I think the parents are like, no, I'm not interested in the school kind of taking my 13-year-old and turning him into the maximal version of whatever self-expression he's going through right now. I want the school to kind of form him in virtue and make him a better person. So I'm actually not surprised that it scored low. I'm a little bit surprised it scored that low.
Mm. What about college and career readiness? Do you think that's just the pendulum swinging back? So that's coming in at -42 and -40. -40 for college readiness, -42 for career readiness. So it seems as if, I can't imagine that parents really don't want their kids to be ready for college or careers, but is it just the pendulum swinging back that college and career readiness is emphasized in such a way those words don't really mean anything anymore?
Yeah, I think when we get to the life outcomes, you'll see they actually do care about college and careers. Mm-hmm. I think maybe those terms are tarnished because they've been the mantra of so many schools for 2 decades now. I think the way people may have read that is, I don't want my kid to just be kind of like forced into all kinds of standardized test prep so he can get into a college that's going to, maybe a college that I don't like. And I don't want him forced into, vocational training that I'm not interested in. So I think it's a combination of the terms themselves and the fact that they want the school focused on human formation, not necessarily those kinds of, more modern, technocratic, practical outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And I think that makes a lot of sense. They don't want their kids perhaps pressured to going into like a 4-year college that might be exceptionally expensive and may not really serve them well for a career anyway. At Thales, we emphasize a lot, vocational skills, vocational training. I know with my own kids, if they were to tell me that they wanted to be an HVAC technician, I would be so happy because I know that I would get free air conditioning service for the rest of my life. What about visual and performing arts? Like, there would be another one that you think would be a lot higher? Or is that lumped in with individuality and self-expression, do you think? Or any reason for that? Maybe just, again, something that's really overly emphasized by the culture that parents are like, I can do without that.
Yeah, that's a little bit disheartening to me too. My wife is a choir teacher, and we value that a lot. I think it could be a couple things. I think it could be what you said, that they're looking at it as more of sort of related to edginess or self-expression or something like that, and they didn't choose it for that reason. I think another one though is a lot of classical schools do promote those things,
Yeah.
but maybe between that and Western civilization, maybe classical school leaders and teachers and other families should kind of take this as a moment to look in the mirror and say, are we really selling this well enough to our families, right? And to the new families who are coming in. So are we giving up on appreciation of Western civilization, and are we giving up on encouraging beauty and skill through visual and performing arts? Are we trading that for maximizing academic potential? And is that a trade that we want to make as classical educators?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really valuable insight. The performing arts, speaking in front of a crowd, elocution, that sort of confidence that comes from doing something in which you can be very embarrassed in front of a large group of people. I mean, those are soft skills that translate really into a wide variety of fields. The Western civilization one is really puzzling me because it comes in at -16 versus classical works, which comes in at 18. So it swings
Yes.
almost like the complete opposite direction. I would want to equate Western civilization with classical works by and large. I know there's not a one-to-one correlation there, but when I see Western civilization, I think, the Old and New Testament, I think Sophocles, I think Tacitus, I think, the Middle Ages. I think there's a lot of things that I think of that I would equate with certain classical books. Did that puzzle you too?
It did, but as we talk through it, I wonder if the difference may be classical works are the works, and Western civilization people read as maybe more of a political statement, which is not what it was intended to be. Interestingly, appreciation for Western civilization got a worse score than citizenship in a global economy did, which was a big surprise to me too. So I wonder just how well we're doing selling Western civilization to our constituents here.
Are you thinking of doing a follow-up study? Because maybe 2-3 years from now, a lot of these things are downstream from culture to the point where we have spent not to get too political, but the last 4 years there has been a lot of America is the source of all the problems in the world, and now we have an administration that's a lot much more positive about traditional American values. The values of the Western tradition. This is something that's unique to America, a sense of American exceptionalism coming back. Do you think maybe in a few years from now, the parents might come around that hey, Western civilization does contain in them ideas about the imago Dei, the value and dignity where each and every human being comes from. Those are ideas that are uniquely rooted in the West, and then maybe we should give this we should value it accordingly.
I think that's a good, along with, the question, what is virtue, which I believe has been asked before. We should poke on this Western civilization question too a little bit. For all the reasons you said, I think that's a good insight.
And life outcomes, so the last bucket of questions, survey options that you gave to parents and classical school leaders was about the type of student that they hoped the school would help produce, help form. Can you walk me through the different walk our audience through the different categories here? Religious involvement, gainfully employed. What sorts of things were
Sure.
buckets you were trying to hit here?
Sure. So these are all questions about, once you've graduated, how do you operate in life? So if you've heard of the Good Soil Report that ACCS did a few years ago, it's looking at sort of similar things to that. So I asked which of these life outcomes are most important or least important to a graduate of your school. So there were things like, you said, religious involvement, being gainfully employed, having a high-paying job, charitable giving, voting, volunteering, marriage and children, questions like this. So the most popular one was being involved in a religious community. That was one of the highest scoring responses on the entire survey. I'll come back to that. Following that was the idea of being gainfully employed, right? So just having a job. So I think that shows kind of the difference in career readiness or college readiness, and then this result of being gainfully employed, getting a high score. I think what that shows us is that parents want their kids to graduate and have, sustainable lives, but they don't want the schools to be overly focused on preparing them for work, right? We had a bunch of questions that kind of scored that were positive, but not very high: volunteering, charitable giving. The lowest score that we saw was, the lowest score on the entire survey was the question of, the item was, graduates of the school delay marriage and having children, right? Mm-hmm. So the negative 86 out of 100. Almost no one who saw that option liked it, right? So the families really don't want their kids to wait forever to get married and have kids. However, being quickly married with children also got a negative score. Not nearly as bad, right? But I think what this tells us is the school leaders and the families who responded, they want their kids to get married and have children, but not too soon and not too late. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what the right range is that they're looking for, but I think that's what that gets to. Having a high-paying job got a negative score, so the parents and the leaders seem to care that their graduates are employed, but they're not super interested in them becoming wealthy necessarily. Prestigious higher ed was a pretty, the students enroll in a prestigious institution of higher education, was ambivalent. It scored pretty close to 0. But then faith-based higher education got a much higher score. Mm-hmm. So families were about 10 times as interested in faith-based colleges than prestigious colleges. So what that tells me is these classical schools are they're looking at a different set of colleges for their kids to attend, right? The big one here that I thought that surprised me was the religious involvement. Students or graduates are involved in a religious community after graduation, getting the highest score. That would not have surprised me, but for the religion score on the previous set of items, right? So what the school respondents are telling us is they're not all extremely interested in having religion taught as an integral part of their schools, of their curriculum, but they're really interested in them being involved in church after they graduate. So how does one square that? I'm not entirely sure. I have some ideas, right? Maybe this is the mismatch between denominations, right? They find a classical school that they like, but they don't necessarily want their kids to continue in that denomination when they graduate. It could be a lot of things. Yeah. I
love thinking about who the parents are that are taking this survey. The idea they want their kids to be gainfully employed. Scored a 51. They don't necessarily care if they have a high-paying job. I mean, I feel like, I don't know if I'm reading this right, but it seems like the parents have some really reasonable, at least indicated by the survey, some pretty reasonable expectations for their kids, because gainfully employed to me says, I can take care of myself and a family. High-paying job, sometimes people place way too much emphasis and pressure on, getting into med school, high finance, that sort of thing. I mean, would you read it like that maybe the parents here that are choosing the sort of option for their school have the right sort of expectations for their kids?
I think so. Remember, these are all relative to each other, and the way that the respondents would have seen it is maybe on the same screen they would see a question that says, which of these is most important to you and which is least important? A high-paying job, volunteering, and being gainfully employed, right? And so they would pick, just get a job. I mean, it's great if you get a high-paying job. They might have selected that if I let them select everything on this list. But when they have to make choices, they're preferring things like religious involvement, volunteering, charitable giving to just getting, becoming partner in a law firm or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with being a partner in a law firm, but yeah, but compared to other things, that's not what they picked.
And just going down the list through here,
Yeah.
so like test scores, voting, I would have thought voting would have been a lot higher. It comes in at -16 and -17.
Yep.
So does that strike you as, are we not like, because in a lot of those definitions of classical education, like Hillsdale's does mention, moral virtues, citizenship. A lot of classical schools will emphasize citizenship. Is that, another area where perhaps we're not selling the parents on like what makes this brand of education so unique? And I mean, a lot of people do tie it to citizenship, this sort of education.
Sure.
Certainly needed to, be responsible, like the liberal arts prepare you for freedom. So does that strike you as being odd, as being like surprisingly low?
Maybe a little bit. I wonder if something like volunteering or charitable giving was sort of taking the place of that in terms of good civic outcomes. And the survey window was in the run-up to the election. So I wonder if people were just not were not excited about the upcoming 2024 election, and they didn't pick it for that reason. So that's a possibility too. But if I had to guess, I would say, yeah, things like volunteering and charitable giving are kind of stand-ins for voting itself. So if they had the option between the two, they picked one of the others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think what do you think parents really want, like out of a classical school? Just looking at all the data that you've compiled and the analysis that you've done, what do you think parents are really looking for when they send their students to a classical school?
Yeah, it's still such an interesting question, right? I think they like you said, they do have reasonable expectations, right? So I think maybe the median parent in this survey, or the median school leader in this survey, would say something like, we're going to do things like Socratic dialogues in our schools. We're going to talk about classical works, and that's going to lead to high test scores and well-formed, morally well-formed students who graduate and are able to become, kind of normal, upstanding citizens in their communities with normal jobs, and take, an interest in their communities in terms of civic involvement and religious involvement. But it's not all about, had all of the answers been what my hypothesis was, which is, religion, tradition, and all these other things like college and career readiness, individuality, citizenship in a global economy, if these had all gotten like really low scores, then you might say that these classical schools are kind of an extreme subculture in America. But I don't think what I just listed out, right? Having a normal life where you kind of give some money, you have a normal job, you do some volunteering. I think people just want pretty basic things that are not, they're not religious extremists. They're not completely disavowing kind of conventional things like literacy and numeracy. So I don't know. The two things that really kind of are disheartening to me are the ideas of that we don't care enough about visual and performing arts. And as a guy who got married very young and has a lot of kids, I wish that number had been a little bit higher, right?
I did think that was I like the way you put it. Like there's a sweet spot, there's a window that the parents really want their kids to get married, not too late, shirking responsibilities, but not too early as if I got married at 26 and my parents did think I was being very, very irresponsible. And getting married at such a, I don't know, and 26 is not old, it's not young. So, out of college and out of job and everything, what else am I supposed to do?
Gainfully employed, probably, right?
Yeah, here at Thales, I remember, it was a couple of weeks after I got the job here that I proposed to my wife and whatnot. That I don't know, that's really normal. That's really normal.
So I think one thing that does come out is people are kind of tired of like fighting things out through the schools, right? I think they have a picture of what they like. They like the kind of the high level idea of what classical schools offer. When you prod them a little bit, I'm not sure there's, the classical schools themselves could probably think a little bit about how they sell their wares to their families on an ongoing basis. But what they don't want is a school that's going to give the kids whatever they want or form them in ways that they don't want.
So in that way, it's really, the emphasis on like reading, like knowledge transfer and formation of character.
Right.
That's really what the school is there for. We should pour everything into transmitting this incredible, valuable body of knowledge to our students. Works that contain a series of transformative ideas that will empower them, that will enlighten them, and allow them to not only know what is good, but to persuade others to choose what is good too. Like anything that deviates from that central mission, you think, like really starts to irritate parents, drive them away. Like the college and career readiness, I feel like that one makes the most sense there. Like if you're trying to fit my kid into a box, really what we want is to pass on this incredibly valuable body of knowledge.
Right, and we're not, and the ultimate goal is not the other sort of criticism classical schools often get is that they're elitist, but that these results don't really show that, right? Like the purpose is not to have high-paying, or people with really high salaries who go to prestigious colleges. The idea is just to follow your family, whatever your family defines as virtue, and move on with kids at about age, I don't know, late 20s. I don't know what the sweet spot is, but yeah.
How representative do you think your study is of America as a whole? That maybe this, especially that prestigious higher educational institution like a Harvard or Yale, what have you, didn't seem like parents, they could almost take it or leave, their kids going to like an Ivy League school. I mean, is that like, hey, the trend is going this way. People really have given up on some of these really elite academic institutions, that's really not the goal for our kids anymore. I mean, it's kind of nice that the goal is like church attendance, religious involvement.
Right. You could maybe read it that way. I don't make a claim that this study is representative of the country as a whole. It's probably not very representative as the country as a whole. It's maybe more representative of the body of classical school enrollees now. We had respondents from a lot of the big networks and a lot of independent schools. So I think it's more representative of that group, but maybe not entirely. So, but that group, it definitely seems like they are walking away from prestigious higher ed and are much more interested in probably a very different set of colleges. And I've heard that for 10 years in interviews and surveys that families in classical schools and other kinds of unconventional school models are just kind of playing a different game from what the kind of mainstream culture is telling them to play, right? So they have a very different list of colleges and majors and things like that they want their kids to get into compared to what you see on the news all the time.
Eric, you are a really good statistician and mathematician in that you're not like making overly grandiose claims about your study and everything that it pretends to speak to. This is not representative of America as a whole. This is not, rather limited as far as the population that you're sampling and the claims that you're making. But I think it gives a lot of really good insights as to what parents are looking for when they're selecting a classical school. So one that's really grounded in the great books of the Western tradition, but also in great books of the Western tradition, character formation, but some sort of practicable, marketable, skill that could leave that student gainfully employed once they get out of school.
It seems like that's right. Now, one thing I would like to do, this is very exploratory. If we did a survey like this again, with a much bigger sample, what we could do is kind of track down groupings, right? So, for example, among the people who said that they really wanted their graduates to be involved in religious communities, did those people pick faith-based higher ed at a higher rate than others? Did they pick prestigious higher ed at a lower rate than others, right? I'd like to redo a lot of this and kind of poke at the idea of virtue again and see if I can kind of suss out some of these different groups, right? Our charter classical school respondents different in some way than private classical school respondents, right? Things like this.
Is that where you're going to, like the next phase of your study, as far as just digging deeper into the data and maybe trying to assess the same people again? Like what's your 5-year plan?
Yeah, I think, well, my immediate next plan would be, yes, to kind of to follow an ancient plan, which is to ask the question, what is virtue? What do we mean by this?
And can it be taught?
And can it be taught?
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the sorts of things I'm interested in. It's a really great thing that the classical school movement has grown so much. I talk about this in the paper earlier on, we've got all these new schools, we've got new teacher support groups, we've got new publishers and all kinds of things. And this is political science 101, right? You want your constituency to get bigger, because once it gets bigger, you have the ability to do more things. But does it change over time, right? And so that's kind of one thing I'm interested in. Are we, as the movement grows, is it staying focused on things like everything that's listed in the classical academic press definition, truth, goodness, and beauty, and things like this? Or is it changing somehow? And are all the people who are coming into it saying that they go to a classical school, and the thing they like best about classical education is we have the best football team in the county or something like that, right? So that's something I'm interested in tracking over time.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. There's no real mention of sports here, like even in the buckets of questions.
Right, I didn't ask about sports. I can tell you, Albert Cheng at the University of Arkansas did, with Cassidy Sifstad, who's now at Hillsdale, did a study of classical charter schools in Texas. And they found a huge growth in that population of schools in Texas. And when they asked parents what they liked and disliked about the schools, they were told by the parents that they liked the sort of the liberal arts education that the kids were getting, but they were frustrated by the facilities and the lack of sports. So I wonder if that's an example of, a crop of new parents coming in. Is it different from what it's been in the past? And does that matter?
Yeah. And sometimes those things seem to be at odds with each other, because a really dynamic sports program often diverts a lot of attention and resources away from what's going on in the classroom. You start, prioritizing, the needs of the athletic department over the needs of students and things like. It just seems to create a series of unnecessary decisions favoring the athletics over academics.
It can. Although, what I find with the hybrid schools is a lot of the value that people find in them is, to the extent they stay small, kids are able to do things like do their academics and also play on sports teams where they wouldn't sniff the court at a much bigger school. And they can get better parts in performing arts shows and things like that. So smaller classical schools are maybe able to kind of give kids all of these experiences that they might not be able to get at a conventional school that ostensibly is everything to everybody and has all different kinds of electives and opportunities, but they kind of shunt you into different pathways, right? So there's, even in the Iliad, they do sports.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I've immensely enjoyed our conversation. Is there anything about your study that we haven't touched on that you think is important for our audience to know about?
Not in the study. I think it's important for people involved in classical schools, though, to think through the process of or the ongoing process of selling classical education to your existing families and kind of coming to an understanding over and over again about what we all mean by that.
And I think you've given us a lot of good insights as to what parents actually want. Great books, character formation, and no expressive individualism.
No, none of that, and a little bit of employability.
Gainfully employed.
That's right. That's right.
Dr. Wearne, I immensely appreciate your time and really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being on Developing Classical Thinkers today.
You too. Thank you so much for having me, Winston.
And thank you so much for listening to this at home. If you're interested in the unique brand of classical education that we have here at Thales Academy, which I assure you includes education grounded in the great books, oriented towards truth, beauty, and goodness, and will help form your student to their highest potential as far as virtue and goodness and wisdom, please check us out at our website at thalesacademy.org. And for Developing Classical Thinkers, I'm Winston Brady. And until next time, stay classy and stay classical.